Hello, welcome to our session. Thank you to all who are tuning in to our session on countering Islamophobia, a cultural diversity seminar for educators. My name is Ishaq Pathan. I'm the Bay Area Director of Islamic Networks Group, and I'm joined here by my co-presenter, Ameena Jandali, who is the content manager at the organization. Islamic Networks Group as an organization is a 27-year-old organization basically working to promote peace through education and interfaith and intercultural engagement. A lot of the work that we do is involved in schools, where we help to supplement curriculum on Muslims and Islam. We help to, through guest speakers as well as lesson plans. We also do work with educators like what we're doing today. Outside of that, we work in other agencies, whether they are healthcare agencies, law enforcement, or corporations. And then we also put on not only curriculum and information on Muslims and Islam, but information on 5 major world religions: Muslims, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Judaism, as well as more recently issues on the intersection of race and religion in terms of bigotry. So things like Islamophobia as a form of bigotry, but also anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, xenophobia, and so on. So you can learn a little bit more about all of our programming at ing.org, at www.ing.org. With that, we're going to go ahead and get started with our seminar. And I'm going to go and share my screen. I guess you can see my screen. So as I mentioned, we are really excited for you all to be joining us today. This is a diversity seminar on Islamophobia in particular, as it relates to Muslim students. Over the course of today, what we're really hoping to do is build a sense of awareness and understanding of the challenges in the current environment that Muslim students are going to be experiencing right now. So we'll talk a little bit about the climate for Muslims on a whole, and then focus a little bit more on the climate for Muslim students in particular as it relates to bullying and other issues that they might face in the classroom. The second part of the seminar will be focused a little bit more on tools and remedies to prevent and respond to this situation, and that will be covered by Ameena. So in part 1, we'll be discussing the challenge. Part 2 will be the solution, and we hope that coming out of this, you will have gained a strong sense of knowledge on both of these pieces of information. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the background for Muslims. So when it comes to Muslim Americans, there's a few things to keep in mind. The first is recognizing that American public sentiment towards Muslims is incredibly negative. So this 2017 poll from Pew, it found that Muslims are rated the most negatively on a coldness to warmth scale. They're rated on an average of 48. This is worse than atheists, Mormons, Hindus, Buddhists, and so on. And so that really sets the climate for an environment where people generally have negative beliefs and attitudes about Muslims in this country. Another study found that those who have from 2019, which is more recent, found that those who have a favorable view of Islam and Muslims are only 15% of the population, and the other percent do not. Or the other percent do not have a favorable view of Muslims and Islam, which is quite sad when thinking about all of the components of Islam that relate to other religions and the ways in which Muslims are here trying to contribute to the country. Where do these things come from? We kind of situate a lot of these negative perceptions in throughout history. And so when people think of Islamophobia, which is the fear and distrust of Muslims or anyone perceived to be Muslim, including people like Sikhs and people like Arabs, Arab Christians, and so on, they often think that it originated after 9/11. The reality is that Islamophobia is a term that originated in the 1920s, and Islamophobic ideas actually date back hundreds of years to the time of colonialism. And so, throughout the mid millennium, the mid 1600s, Europeans basically sought out to colonize the rest of the world. And what they ended up doing was, conquering all non-European nations for the purposes of power, for the purposes of resources, and things like that. And the justifications for doing so weren't necessarily, we want to go and dominate these people because they have things we want. The justification for the theory was more along the lines of, we are superior people, and we need to go to these other parts of the world and spread our sense of civilization to them and offer it to them. And in the process of doing that, they needed to position themselves as being superior to the others around the world. And so in order for me to justify, if I was a European, in order for me to justify going into Africa and saying that Africans, and saying that I was better, I needed to then describe the people of Africa as being worse or inferior. And as a result, non-white, non-European people at this time become viewed in this way as being backwards, exotic, sexist, and violent. And this is the case of the indigenous peoples in the Americas. This is the case of Muslims. This is in the case of tribes throughout the African continent. This is in the case of people in Asia who are viewed as overly submissive and weak, as an example. And so that's really important to know, because that's where we start to get these ideas. So when we think of Muslims today as being backwards or as being violent in the case of terrorism, these ideas had originated at that time. They're not new. They're not, emerging after 9/11, as an example. These peoples were often viewed as positioned against Christianity because there was a desire to spread a very particular notion of Christianity to these groups. Another component to this process was racialization, in which all of these different groups were viewed as one. So race becomes introduced, where we start to see Muslims living. There's all different types of Muslims. There's 1.8 billion there's many around the world, and they all become viewed as racialized as just being Muslim. Or another example would be thinking about indigenous peoples and how they're coming from tons of different tribes throughout the Americas, but they're all viewed as Indians. Or those who are in Africa coming from, again, many different tribes, all being viewed as Black, based on this idea of this group of people has similar physical characteristics, and we're going to then group them together based on those characteristics. And then through those characteristics, we're going to say that certain groups are like this and stereotype them in one way, and other groups are like this. And in all situations, white and European was superior and everything else was inferior, which is why, on a scale of race now, even at present, whiteness is at the top and Blackness is at the bottom. These things originate during this time and still have effects in our society today in the form of many things, including things like current events, political rhetoric, Islamophobia, as well as others. And so when we think about Muslims now, current events that happen that involve Muslims and otherwise, they fan the flames of these implicit perceptions that people have of Muslims. And so people automatically might assume Muslims to be terrorists. And so when something happens in the news, it just confirms that. When it comes to political rhetoric, what we've seen with things like an election season, when certain candidates may say negative things about Muslims, or just position Muslims as being foreign, or introduce policies that demonize Muslims, then we start to see that Islamophobia start to rise. The consequences of this are very unfortunate for Muslims. They include this idea that in 2017, nearly half of all Muslim Americans experienced some discrimination in the last year. It usually is in the form of treated with being suspicion, being called names, seeing anti-Muslim graffiti around the community, and so on. Now that number increases to 64% when those Muslims are visibly Muslim. And when we say visibly Muslim, what we mean is a Muslim woman who wears a headscarf, a Muslim man who has darker skin and a longer beard, or a head covering. These things like that, when people are much more aware of the people being Muslim, that might create even more discrimination, which is unfortunate. We've also seen a rise in hate crimes. And so across the state of California, hate crimes have risen for all different groups, whether they're African American, Jewish, Indigenous, and so on, and Latinx, and so on. And so for Muslims, that number has also increased over the last few years. in the form of attacks on mosques and arsons, in the form of attacks on Muslim individuals in the streets, being exposed to and being exposed to other forms of bias and bigotry. Now, the next question is how does this stuff impact Muslim American students? And so when thinking through Muslim American students, there's a few things. Number one is bullying. And so the national average for bullying is around 20 to 25% of students overall. When it comes to Muslims, that number is about double, with 53% of students in California exclaiming that they have been made fun of, insulted, or being abused for being Muslim. This usually is verbal, in the form of people calling Muslim students terrorists, or saying you're going to bomb us. For Muslim females, about a third of the Muslim females in the study have had their hijabs or headscarves offensively pulled or tugged, which is again a form of physical assault, but also has a religious connotation to it. Unfortunately, this ongoing harassment, results in shame. Students are often, bullying is a topic that many students choose not to discuss in the first place, and really just adds a strong sense of helplessness to students because they don't view adults as being able to solve it, and they don't view their own selves as being able to solve it. When it comes to classroom discussions, we've also seen, a few different things. So the number of Muslim students who don't feel comfortable in class discussions increased by 50% from 2014 to 2016. These are a result of many things, including, viewing current events as focusing on us versus them. The them in this case are Muslims. Having discussions that lack sensitivity towards civilians who died in Muslim areas. And so thinking through, like, a tragedy happens in France or Spain and like the whole school shuts down. But when a tragedy happens in a Muslim area, like Lebanon, let's say, which was, a few weeks ago, does a school, does a classroom offer that same level of sensitivity to these places, and usually not. This results in feelings of dread or shame for a lot of Muslim students who just don't look forward to it. Sometimes Muslim students are put on the spot in the classrooms, asked to speak on behalf of Muslims around the world, whether in positive or negative frames. It's really not good because it singles them out. And so all of these things really create a sense of stress and anxiety for a lot of Muslim students. And the last thing is conflicted identity. And so sometimes some of these prejudices come from teachers. In a report in 2014, or in a report in 2017, 38% of teachers reported, of students reported, 38% of teachers have reported offensive comments about their religion. 38% of students reported offensive comments about their religion by teachers or administrators or school staff. And we've seen cases of that. I heard of one situation of a student in Richmond. What had happened was the Muslim holiday happened to coincide with September 11th, and the teacher asked the student, "What are you?" The teacher said the students asked for accommodations for the holiday, which is what she's entitled to, in terms of religious rights in school, to be able to take off. And the teacher made a comment about her celebrating 9/11 as being the reason as to why she needed to take off from school. Which again is horrible, given that you have one student that is already in an environment as a minority where they are practicing a holiday in a religion that is not associated with other people, and they're trying to establish some sort of pride in that holiday. And then this teacher, in their power, completely derails that with making comments about associating her and Muslims with the horrible acts of 9/11, which all people around the world, Muslims at the forefront, would denounce. Social media is a big thing, and I think this is really important, especially during COVID-19. So at a time when a lot of students are at home and not in school, they are exposed more and more to statements and other things on social media about that are negative about Muslims and Islam. And they're on these platforms and on these sites much more than they might have been otherwise. And so that's just kind of hurting their psyche because they're not getting other positive information. That results to shame, that results in kind of not feeling confident about your identity. This survey of San Francisco students, it found that 30% of students said they don't want others to know that they're Muslim, and 15% that if they could hide it, at some times they would. And that again is really sad when thinking about wanting to create a climate of inclusivity and a climate where everyone feels comfortable and safe in their environment, having students wanting to hide a really central component of their identity that they would not hide maybe at home is not a good sign for us as a society, as a collective. And then they also may suffer from anxiety or stress because of these things. Now, bearing all of that in mind, it's important to recognize that students, on a whole, it's really challenging to be a student right now, especially in COVID-19, especially when you're dealing with all of these different things and recognizing this huge adjustment to your education. And so adding in factors like these, where students are being exposed to Islamophobia on a whole, and then specifically in certain schools and by other students through chats and things like that, just really makes things a lot worse. And I think cyberbullying especially is really important, given that, like as we're seeing now, it follows the student home. So they don't get a break from it in the way that they might get a break if they were going to school and getting physically teased and then came home and they didn't have to deal with that. So on a whole, we're gonna pause for questions now. For anyone to kind of ask anything relating to anything I spoke about. So that could include the general climate about about perceptions of Muslims, Islamophobia in terms of its historical roots and its more present day roots, and then the impact on Muslim American students. So we'll take a second to pause and see if there are any questions in the chat. Okay. The next slide is a series of reflection questions, and we don't really have time, but if you want to answer them in the chat, you're welcome to. I'm just going to take a second to go through them, and it's something you might want to write down to think about as we move forward. These are some concrete guidelines and questions about, how should this inform how we go about our schools moving forward. So the first is, generally, how does Islamophobia intersect with other forms of bigotry? When we think about Muslim students, are they necessarily they have negative attitudes towards them, but are they different to the experiences of other students, especially from more marginalized or minority backgrounds? And the answer is no, in a lot of ways. The narratives on colonialism that I mentioned affect all students that come from these non-European backgrounds, whether they're Black or Latinx and so on. And we're seeing that, I think, with the introduction of ethnic studies and ethnic studies as a curriculum is really focusing a lot more on these groups, which I think is really important, so that we can, because they recognize that intersection. But Islamophobia is not necessarily an isolated issue, but rather is just one form of other forms of bigotry that intersect to decrease the quality of life for certain elements of the population. When it comes to the current environment, it's important to think about how does the current environment affect our students and their psyches. And again, you can ask this about Muslims, but you can also broaden it to any students in your school. The third question is really a reflection question for you all, whether and how and if this is manifested in your school. What are the experiences of Muslim students? Do you know the Muslim students in your school? Are they identifiable? Have you spoken with them? Is there generally a climate of inclusivity or not? And then finally, what steps can be taken to reduce bullying and improve the general environment? And Ameena will go into this, but these are, I think, important questions, especially as we go from a broad, presentation that we're doing to a group of people who are all around the state of California, to a more specific, when it comes to your school specifically, what can be done, what is happening, and what can be done. So I'm gonna, if there are no questions, I'm gonna just, oh, great. Sure. Yeah, so the question is around, creating dialogue for different students and what kind of opening guiding questions would we recommend. And I'm gonna answer, and I'll also ask my co-presenter Ameena to chime in as well if she has suggestions. But my thought is when we're dealing with the thing of identity and empathy, I think it's interesting to start with and in dialogue is to start with with students being able to kind of like situate where they are as it relates to the topic. So having students be able to, all of your students be able to, do some identity exercise where they're aware of, where they're identifying all of the components of their identity, whether it's in terms of religion, in terms of gender, in terms of race, ethnicity, nationality, language. See what are those elements where people really understand, and what are those elements where people maybe not understand. And then that will automatically start to create a situation where students are able to express the elements of themselves that they feel are less understood by other peers, and be able to kind of work through those. Other things around guiding questions around dialogue and identity is to really like, you can always like address the specific groups of each religion, and so like gather the Muslim students in your school, and then just basically start to ask them questions. What are your experiences in the school? Is it how do you find the environment? Is there anything you need from us as teachers? Would be an example of things like that. But that's more like specific to what you could ask teachers, less than like activities between students. Ameena, I don't know if you have additional ideas about dialogue between students.
I mean, I think one of the strongest and most effective tools is empathy, creating empathy. So I know there's these exercises where you have kids move forward if they've experienced something, or if they're privileged in a certain way, and they can then see the shared experiences with other groups, even though it might be a different reason that person is being demonized or otherized. They can then see the commonalities, and that helps to create empathy. So any kind of exercises in that vein, I think, are really useful.
If the person who asked that question is looking for something a little bit more specific, they're welcome to add that into the question, and we can address that. And I don't know if there are any other questions before we move on to part 2. Great. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on to part 2. I'm going to pass it over to Ameena to kind of walk through the second section of the presentation.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some tools to prevent and respond to bullying. And do I have control, or you do, Ishaq? Oh, okay. So we're going to just look at different areas. Let's go to the next slide. Including looking at your district policies, because all districts have some kind of policies around bullying, the importance of having staff awareness about students' backgrounds and different cultures they may be coming in contact with. And then we're going to talk about some of the educator curriculum resources that we have, as well as the importance of parent engagement. And then the last section is about reasonable accommodations for Muslim students. So in terms of, next slide, your district policies, each district obviously has some kind of policy around bullying, because it is widely acknowledged the harmful effects of bullying in terms of both learning as well as school attendance, and just providing a safe environment for all students. So they're feeling safe, they're not being harmed either physically or emotionally. And obviously, in order to kind of get that information out there, there is training that is done or should be done to all teachers and all staff for them to really understand the legal obligation they have to the district, to all of its employees, to prevent any kind of harassment, discrimination, intimidation, bullying of district students, because that does impact the entire school environment and the entire school district environment. And this training should provide skills to all staff members to be able to discuss diversity, be more inclusive, and to really acknowledge the different immigration patterns maybe that are impacting their school district, as well as any other experiences from American-born, or all of the diversity that exists in that district. The other component here for the staff side is staff awareness of the student background, and really, as much as possible, giving them the understandings about this particular population. So for Islam and Muslims, which is what we're talking about today, we actually have an online presentation that is accessible to the general public. The link is on the bottom of the screen. If you go to our website, it's under curriculum, but it's specifically GTCAM-public. And this presentation goes through some very basic terminology that Muslims use or that are used to talk about Muslims, as well as demographics, and then some of the basic Islamic teachings, values, and other beliefs, as well as the relationship of Islam to other Abrahamic traditions that helps people to better understand it. The presentation also addresses common misconceptions, specifically around misconceptions about Muslim diversity, the understanding that Muslims are very diverse. They come from many different countries, the role of extremism, and then, of course, around women, which is a lot of where some of the misunderstandings come vis-a-vis the religion, and then around pluralism and religious tolerance. So this is a really good resource to just learn more about basics on Islam and Muslims. Other educator resources include just having an understanding about what can and cannot be acceptable when teaching about religion in schools. And we take these guidelines from the First Amendment Center, which is based on the First Amendment religious clauses that very clearly state Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, meaning there is no state religion, or prohibit the free exercise thereof. That means that everybody has religious freedom in this country. So any teaching about religion needs to be academic, not devotional. And basically that means that the school or the speaker or anyone discussing religion is trying to create awareness about religion, not acceptance of any religion. And the school is sponsoring study about, not practice of religion. So there are very fine differentiations in what you can and cannot do. Part of that is exposing students to a diversity of religions, not just one particular viewpoint or one particular religion. And in doing all of that, educating about all religions, but not promoting or denigrating any other religion or any religion. Informing, but not making students conform. So it is important to talk about religion. Religion is very much a part of history, about social studies, but it is how it is taught that is really important. So we actually offer a number of presentations and panels, and during COVID, all of these have gone online. Like I said, we have our most basic presentation, Getting to Know American Muslims and Their Faith, which is a very brief overview about the faith and its practitioners. We also have a presentation about Muslim contributions to civilization, mainly during kind of the Middle Ages, which have been referred to as the Golden Age of Islam, but bringing us even to the present. A History of Muslims in America is a brief look at the history of Muslims, starting with even before Columbus, to the transatlantic slave trade, to early immigration, and bringing it up to the current present. And then the last one is about stereotypes about Muslim women, and that's more suitable for high schools. The other ones are suitable for both middle and high schools. We also offer interfaith panels that include representatives from either the two faiths, Judaism and Islam, or the three Abrahamic faiths, adding Christianity, or all five major world faiths, talking about current topics such as living the faith, shared values among faiths, religion and pluralism, etc. And these can also be requested. And then we also have a panel that talks about the roots of bigotry between various groups, whether we're talking about African Americans, indigenous peoples, Asians, Jews, Muslims. The bigotry is interconnected, and we really dig deep to see where those connections are and how it continues to impact us today. So these are all resources that you can bring to your classroom. Next slide. We also have online curricula that reflects a lot of these topics. So we just talked about the presentations relating to Islam and Muslims, Getting to Know American Muslims and Their Faith, the history of Muslims, Muslim contributions, and Muslim women. All of those have extensive lesson plans that accompany the slides that we use when we present. And these curriculum all are very detailed. They include an actual presentation with notes, discussion questions, and activities that can be done throughout the kind of the slide presentation, and then dozens of supplemental films that are accompanied by questions. So it's a very rich group of curriculum and all of these diverse topics. And we also have presentations and notes about Ramadan, which is very timely when it is now finally in the school year, and then about Islamophobia. So these are all available to educators. They need to register, and then they'll be sent links to be able to access them and download them. Next. And then this is open to anybody. We have over 100 answers to frequently asked questions, just general questions about Islam and Muslims, and then specific answers to questions about Sharia. And these range from the very basic to, who's God, how do Muslims pray, to the very kind of sophisticated around democracy, we have a lot of women's issues, modernity, etc. So these are just very useful for self-education and can also be used to supplement teaching about Islam and Muslims. Next. We also feature on our website a number of other online resources. I just mentioned the First Amendment Center, which is really the basis of how we teach about Islam. Religious Freedom Center, Tannenbaum, you're probably familiar with them, teaching tolerance. All of these are really great resources to teach about Islam, Muslims, and other communities. We also carry some of the major documentaries that have been done through PBS, through 1001 Inventions, which has a lot of films and resources about Muslim contributions. Films like Islam, Empire of Faith. And these are a lot of the same films and videos that we include in our curriculum. So these are also available on our website. It's also important to really understand and to encourage parent engagement, especially when you have communities that are not as, familiar with the school system or maybe not as plugged into the school system. So some of the ways, next slide, that you can do that is to really emphasize that to all parents. Their involvement in the school is good for the academic and social success of their children, but it also is good for the school community, because when everyone's involved, when everyone's working for an inclusive school community, it's much more likely that that's going to be the outcome. So obviously some of these things have been put on hold, but when things get back to normal, it's really important for all parents to come to back to school night, come to open houses, obviously coming to any parent-teacher conferences, but also really reaching out to parents that may not even know about volunteer opportunities in the classroom or in the school, making that extra effort to plug them in and to maybe encourage other parents to be welcoming towards them, because it can be daunting if you haven't done this before. And getting involved in social events. International Night is obviously a great one for, highlighting diversity and inclusivity. But even things like the science fair, if you have parents who have, that scientific background. So these are just a few ways to really get parents engaged. So now I'm going to talk about some reasonable accommodations for Muslim American students in the classroom and in school. And I'm just going to begin by talking very briefly about students' religious rights. We talked about, the guidelines for teaching or talking about religion, but it's also important to understand religious rights that also come out of the First Amendment, such as the right to wear religiously mandated clothing. That is unique in the United States, that this is actually protected by law. That means a woman or a girl who wears a headscarf, the school cannot force her to take it off. That is her religious right. Or observe dietary rules, avoiding pork, avoiding some of the things that, other religions also abstain from. And even the right to engage in personal worship, as long as it's not disruptive, meaning it's not during class time, it's not proselytizing. Those are rights of students. So students actually have a lot of rights when it comes to practicing their religion in school. In addition to the First Amendment, the Equal Access Act of 1984 affirmed the right of students to participate in student-initiated religious activities, such as religious clubs. This could be a Bible study. It could be just talking about religion among co-religionists or even among others, as long as it's done in an appropriate manner, which is non-proselytizing, and coercive. So some of the other religious practices that may impact them at school include, like I mentioned, the fact that observant Muslims, and not all Muslim students are going to be observant. There may be students who their family's not observant, so they're not observant. But if you have a student you know is observant, there's going to be the problem with pork or pork byproducts, which is pretty basic, but it also could include things that are not as clearly a problem, like gelatin. And you do find gelatin in a lot of kid-friendly foods, such as marshmallows, some candies, even yogurts. In terms of dress, as I mentioned, some girls may wear hijab, which is the headscarf, and modest clothing, which may be a source, particularly when there are events around Muslims. It may be a source of teasing and maybe a source of harassment. Gender relations, you might have some students who want to avoid partnering with the opposite gender in maybe drama class or for lab, just out of modesty and out of a feeling of comfort. During PE, some students, especially if they do wear the headscarf, may want to be excused from swimming because they're not going to be able to wear a regular swimsuit, or from dancing. And prayer, some students may ask to pray at school. That may mainly affect them during the time of the year when it is winter and the prayer times are closer together. In the spring and the fall, the afternoon prayer is as a longer window of time, and so it ends like 4:30, 5:30, so the students can get home and pray that at school. But during the winter, when the days are much shorter, they would need to pray at school. And if it can be made possible for them to pray in the library or in an empty classroom, that is the best solution for them. They probably don't want to pray in a very public place. In Ramadan, fasting students may request to not have to participate in lunch, rather to go to the library, go to the computer lab. And then in terms of holidays, because Muslim holidays are lunar, they rotate around the entire year. And so it makes it a little more challenging to kind of be aware of those holidays. But a lot of schools are now putting Muslim holidays on the calendar. And so students may be absent at the very least on these two main holidays, and any schoolwork they miss should be allowed to be made up. So these are the main areas of religious practices at school. And so I'm going to open up for any questions and answers, and that could be for either of us.
Thank you, Ameena. So just as a recap, Ameena really spoke about a few different areas that are important when it comes to resources for Muslim students. The first of which is following school guidelines and policies. The second is educating, having educator understanding about the religion and as it relates to Muslim students. So when it comes to prayer, why do Muslims pray? Like, what does it mean about prayer? Why might it be important for a Muslim student to need to pray during school? Things like that. And then the third is all resources that are available to educators, and all of those that Ameena mentioned by ING are all free for teachers as well, whether it's the guest speakers and the panels or the curriculum that we offer online. It's all available to educators for no cost. Parent engagement is also really important as we, especially are navigating, parents from maybe a different culture who need to kind of become more integrated in terms of how the system works. And then the last is accommodations. And there are plenty of accommodations that can be made for students to not, prohibit their free exercise. And that will also just promote that, strong level of inclusivity for students. So if you have any questions about specifics of something that you've encountered while being a teacher, or something you've noticed about Muslim students that you're wondering, or a question it could be about the Muslim tradition. If you wanted to learn a little bit more about prayer or fasting, we could happily talk about any of those topics. We wanted to just start out by giving you an overview of the whole discussion, and then use the remaining time to address specific questions that you might have as educators in the space. It doesn't look like we have any questions so far. So I will just kind of direct to some more resources. A big resource that you can go to for ING related materials is our Educator Toolkit, and that's at www.ing.org/educator EDUCATOR-toolkit. That will take you to basically a segment on our website that has resources for educators, for administrators, and for parents, all of which are, I think, really valuable to those specific areas. And the one for parents includes a lot of resources for Muslim teenagers. And so if you have students in your school, Muslim students that want to be more involved in educating about their faith or dealing with bullying, then we have a whole program for that, which is our youth program that basically works to build up Muslims' teenager confidence and enable them to, give presentations about Muslims and respond to questions and things like that. So that is another option. On our website, we also have tons of resources for teachers in the toolkit, including Ameena mentioned the holidays. We have a calendar for the next 5 years about various holidays that Muslim students have throughout the year. So that will help you to plan ahead. We have a book list as well, and the book list will feature different literature relating to Muslims and Islam, including a whole section on children's literature, both fiction and nonfiction that relate to the topic. And then we have pieces of information on all of the different things, whether it's on Ramadan or the Muslim New Year or on the holidays and things like that. I just want to see if there are any questions that we've had so far. Sure. So the question is, how do you discourage singling out a Muslim student while still having conversations that are comfortable for everyone? In terms of this, I would love if the person could ask clarification as to what specifically they mean in terms of the conflict between the singling out of a student and having a conversation that's for everyone. Sure. So when I was talking about singling out, what I meant is this idea of, okay, let's say something happens, there is a major event that happens around the world. Without the student saying anything to indicate how they feel, if a teacher were to call on the student and say, my name is Ishaq, if they were saying, Ishaq, what do you think about what just happened? That student now is put on the spot and doesn't really have the preparedness nor the emotional thing to be able to deal with that question. If there's a question on, if there's, you're talking about Muslims and Islam for your 7th grade world history unit, and then you talk about prayer, and then you say, hey, Ishaq, you're a student, do you pray? I think there are chances where the student will be happy to answer, but there are other chances where if the student isn't familiar very much with prayer or doesn't pray or something they might feel very uncomfortable by a question like that. And so I think that's what we mean by not singling out students. Now, when it comes to I think the best thing to do to avoid all of that is to check in with a student before, in private, and just say, hey, I'm about to teach the unit on Muslims or Islam. If you have anything that you want to add during that unit, let me know, and we can talk about that. And then they might be more open, or they'll tell you at the forefront that they actually don't want to talk about it. When it comes to a current event, if you're dealing with a current event that relates specifically to an area that is Muslim majority, again, doing that same protocol of just checking with a student before class and asking them, hey, I'm going to talk about this thing. I don't know if you have any opinions on it. That will just make them a little bit more comfortable and confident when it comes to the thing. And if they did have if they do feel uncomfortable by the topic, then it might become more apparent during the classroom discussion whether they'll either speak up, or if they don't speak up, they might just stay silent and feel uncomfortable. And in which case, you can always ask after the fact by just saying, hey, I want to check in regarding today's classroom education, lesson. How did you feel about it? And I don't think that's singling out necessarily because it's private. It's more just in front of the whole class, putting a student on the spot in an uncomfortable position where they're not expecting it, especially. But there are students who would want to answer questions. But I think knowing where they are when it comes to that before you actually do that would be important. Ameena, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I mean, we encounter that when we go into classrooms to speak about the topic, and there are students, I can tell by their name they're Muslim, and they don't raise their hand. They don't offer any information. Other students are like, oh yeah, so they usually will make it pretty apparent if they want to share or not. And so kind of based on that, but yeah, I mean, having a conversation before the unit is also a great idea. In terms of, being inclusive, well, one of the problems arises, for instance, if the only time you're talking about Muslims is during current events, and it's going to be something negative, and no matter what happens, if that student is from a particular background, they're going to be feeling uncomfortable. So it's important to balance out, the events that are being talked about. If we're talking about a terrorist attack, let's also talk about something positive. It can't all be negative, and unfortunately, that is the way the news is. Additionally, even worse, as Ishaq talked about, considering that student an expert, somehow, having that student represent that particular event, whether it's a Muslim student or any student. I mean, there are very delicate topics that we have to discuss in social studies, and we have to be aware that it is going to be impacting students from those groups in a different way. And then on the positive side, when we are talking about various topics, it could be, you know, in math, it could be in geography, it could be anything, making sure to be as inclusive as possible. I mean, we're seeing that a lot commercially. You can, you know, walk by Gap and see the picture of a girl in hijab. You're seeing it, you know, when it hits the market, we know it's really hit, right? If we could kind of mirror that also in our schools, where positive images reflect all of us, not just, you know, the mainstream, that will also counter some of the negative images.
Great, thank you, Ameena. Are there any other questions, or if that person who asked that question needs clarification or something, you can go ahead and ask. Sure. I think a big thing is really like thinking through what narrative as a teacher, what narrative do we see in the classroom, and whether that is whether we feel that's inclusive or not. And so, you know, a lot of times, if we're not being intentional about wanting to highlight the accomplishments of you know, groups of people around the world, or focus on, you know, balanced news stories, if that's not on our mind, then chances are, because of implicit biases, because of historical narratives and things like that, we might be perpetuating, you know, the negative images about different groups of people, whether they're Muslim or otherwise. And so I think that's where it's really important to something like inclusivity is not a passive thing. It's really an active thing. And so for, you know, I applaud everyone here for attending this conference, because the conference is all about inclusivity. So I thank you for doing that. And then even, you know, spreading whatever you learn here to other teachers around would be important, to really, like, you know, again, emphasize this idea that inclusivity is a value and an action, and takes initiative and effort, so that, you know, I'm in touch with the news, and it doesn't take me having a Muslim student in class to know that, you know, if this was a worldwide tragedy that just struck another country, I should treat it the same way I might treat a tragedy that struck the United States or struck Europe, because those are always brought up, as I mentioned, or at least they were when I was a student, but the other ones may not be. And regardless of whether or not there's a Muslim student in class or not, or any student from that group, I think bringing that into the picture will just provide a more, you know, holistic perspective on the world, and create students that are more globally oriented, who are aware of what's going on around the world. And did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that we're all human. We all are subject to the same forces that everyone else is. I mean, teachers do shape society, and so they take it upon themselves to try to move beyond that, but we are human. So I mean, I've had teachers come to me and ask me many questions about Islam, because they had Muslim students in the classroom, and these were students who were very supportive. I had a teacher who actually sat and created wrapping paper for when they were doing, you know, Christmas activities, to have a wrapping paper that was specific to a Muslim. I mean, she really went the whole 9 yards, but she had a lot of misconceptions about Islam and Muslims, which, you know, surprised me, because she was trying very hard to be inclusive. So I think it's important to acknowledge our own biases. We're all human. We're all subject to the same, you know, media, Hollywood, whatever it is that is subconsciously forming some of our, you know, perceptions about each other, and try to really acknowledge and then deal with that. That'll help us to be more authentic in the classroom when we interact with, you know, students from various backgrounds, and then it'll make inclusivity feel real. So that's one area. Certainly, it's become more challenging with so much diversity in the classrooms. You know, you can't know about every single culture. You can't know about every single, you know, you got maybe 50 different backgrounds represented in your classrooms. But as much as possible, just having a little bit of that cultural competence, that will just make the student sit a little taller, make them feel a little more like they belong, whether it's, you know, the greeting, you know, at the beginning of the day, maybe every day have a different greeting in a different language or something visual. So inclusivity can take many different formats and many different venues, but I think the goal is that every single student in that classroom should feel represented, and maybe starting the year by really trying to locate what that looks like, and then working from there. So I commend all of you for attending today. That's definitely the first step in really working for inclusivity. And in terms of more details about Islamophobia, I think reviewing our presentation online, that will really give you some of the insight into what lends itself to Islamophobia, whether we're talking about the media, where studies have showed that disproportionately most stories about Muslims are negative. And so that's what the students are seeing. They're going to have some embedded, internalized ideas about themselves. So they may be challenged themselves about their Islamic identity. Whether it's movies, it's very rare to see a Hollywood movie where you see yourself if you're a Muslim or an Arab. There's actually a book that documents hundreds of movies and TV shows in the past century, and they are overwhelmingly negative. And, you know, all of these digital forms have a great impact on our students, the same thing on social media. And so I think reviewing that Islamophobia presentation will be helpful for you to see all of the different forces that impact both ourselves as educators, our students, and even the students themselves.
Yeah, and the link to the Islamophobia presentation is www.ing.org/Islamophobia. So the website ing.org has a ton of resources, including these presentations that Ameena just mentioned, but also other things like that toolkit, which has a ton of resources for educators. If there are no further questions, then we'll go ahead and wrap up today. Just want to check for that last thing about questions. Thank you. So there are no other questions. So we hope that you'll take some of the information that's here today and bring it back to your schools, bring it back to your classrooms, especially in a way of, again, promoting that inclusivity where it's not only Muslims but it's also all students, recognizing that if we want to uplift one, we should uplift all. And so I think that's really important as we move forward. And yeah, so we'll wrap up now. So thank you again for all who attended. Thanks to our organizers. Thank you to the city, the Santa Clara Department of Education, for our County Office of Education for organizing this conference. We were here last year, which was in person. And here we are virtually, and I know we're all doing our best. And so, and thank you to the teachers again, especially those who are operating online this year. It's incredibly challenging to do so, and to be able to adapt all of your lessons that you've been doing in an online way. And so we really applaud you for all of the work that you're doing to help students around the country, and not only that work, but other work in terms of being able to manage students whose, I'm sure, whose stresses are extremely high right now, given the uncertainty of the situation that we all find ourselves in now. So thanks again. Thank you to our technical support as well for helping us with the setup and making sure everything ran smoothly, and the organizers again. So we appreciate that.